Hello and welcome to another video on this channel. Today we are joined by Jufu Warren to talk about the value of fiction. Hope you're having a good day so far, and of course if you enjoy this content then make sure to put any comments, questions and ideas in the live chat. That is where you can indeed reach out to us. So without further ado, let's get right into this discussion and talk about fiction. Jufu, how are you and what is fiction?
I'm feeling pretty good. So me and Josh thought we could start with talking about maybe how one can differentiate between fiction and nonfiction, or whether it is differentiable. And well, my proposal kind of is that it is actually very difficult for one to differentiate between fiction and nonfiction, because the very writing down of certain things, the very putting of actual events into narration already selects out events that is to be narrated and other events. So in this sense, I think nonfiction is also fiction, but perhaps just it's more on a spectrum, and every single nonfiction already has something about fiction. If it doesn't have any fictional element, it will be uninteresting. We would just live out our everyday lives rather than going to read the book. And I guess what I'm proposing here is something like, well, we actually get more out of nonfiction if we start reading nonfiction using a fictional way.
I think that what is very interesting here is the question of, well, what on earth does fiction and nonfiction mean? Because of course, when you're growing up as a child, the common question is, well, what is fiction? What is nonfiction? You ask the teacher, and in fiction, people say, well, fiction is what is true, non-true, or nonfiction is what is true or historical. But then the question naturally rises that, is that distinction valued, or is that distinction actually correct? Because it does appear to me that a lot of fiction is fundamentally true, and true in a very abstract sense, of course, but I do think it's true in the same way. And in the same way, you turn and say, what is nonfiction? In some sense, you could say, well, perhaps fiction is at least good fiction, because of course we all know those few stupid writers who just write trash, and then that is fiction in the dumbest way possible, right?
Like Joshua Yen.
Yes, indeed. Go check out Christianity for All. But no, I do think that there are certain books where you think, well, okay, that doesn't really seem to be true. But you then look at nonfiction, right? And you look at it and say, well, let's look at fiction. And in some sense, the best fiction is that which almost combines nonfiction in a certain sense and says, well, this is the set of nonfiction. Let us wrestle with that set of nonfiction. And then when you have that under control, then you can move forward and say, well, yes, the best fiction of Dostoevsky, of Romance of the Three Kingdoms, Samgot Yini, is kind of like saying, well, they take upon aspects of truth, what is most true in what they experience in the world, the nonfiction, and then accumulate that into a certain set of books. And in some sense, fiction at its peak is accumulation of what is most true about society, or the archetypes which are most true in society.
Mm-hmm. I agree, but then I think there's also another thing, right? So you can why can't we just directly describe those archetypes rather than going into fiction? You see, maybe we can have the fiction and a non-fiction sort of journalistic kind of thing. But there's also another kind of non-fiction, let's say like philosophical theory or more academic kinds of books. And I guess the question is, what is the value that we get in fiction beyond the mere sort of academic theorizing about the fiction? Or let's say, why do we want to actually read the Brothers Karamazov or War and Peace rather than just reading the summary on SmartNotes of those two books? That's, I think, the interesting question.
Is this distinction something kind of like the myth of Sisyphus contra the stranger, kind of like the fiction and the philosophy underneath?
Or happiness versus nausea.
Yeah. I do think that one of those things where you'll look at it, and it's one of those things where you'll perhaps say, well, maybe the beauty of fiction is that it is multi-realizable, or you could interpret it in many different ways. In the same way that if you look at nonfiction, it is way more limited, because the way that academics write it has to be in some sense univocal, and it has to be clear. Rather in fiction, there are multiple ways to interpret a certain topic. And even though it might differ from what the author originally intended, you could still nevertheless find truth within those things in which you interpret, precisely because they represent the culture and the structure in which you're living in. And now I sound like a postmodernist, but in some degrees, I think that is precisely this multiple interpretation of a work, of a fiction work, which makes it valuable.
Yeah, and I think it does sound a bit like this postmodernist. We can interpret fiction as endlessly interpretable, and I would agree that it is the strength of fiction. But perhaps what we can say is, rather than it being that fiction, other than you can just play around with fiction, and other than the writer's intention, you don't have to be fidel to that. We can say that maybe that's my idea, is that fiction somehow tries to represent the world as it is directly given to the author. And in this sense, the author does not do any interpretation onto the world. And that is why it is endlessly interpretable by other people. Because there's, in really good fiction, there's exactly a lack of authorial presence inside, but rather the author directly giving his or her own world to you, allowing you to step into their world.
I think that that's definitely true, and I think that one of the questions which you would then ask is, well, what actually is the relationship between the author's world in which we step into and the world in which we live in? And that would naturally be the question, because the clash of culture, the clash of ideas would naturally lead to this kind of multiple interpretations arising. And I suppose the natural question leading on from that is, well, is there actually anything true, correct, or incorrect when it comes to these interpretations? Is there potentially a certain kind of problem, or is there potentially a certain kind of issue in reading or viewing these certain ideas?
Well, I would say the interpretation of fiction is inherently political. Political not in the sense of like left and right clashing, but political in sort of this Arantian sense of each person trying to speak in their individuality in order to speak out their quote-unquote own truth. I guess the idea is that when we're interpreting fiction, what we're trying to do is to get out our own opinion in a really true way. Just as when Socrates questions people, what Socrates is trying to do is not necessarily getting directly to the truth, but he is improving your opinion by constantly destroying it and rebuilding it. And I think that might be one of the usefulness of fiction. So when we're interpreting it, what we're also doing is interpreting ourselves. And in such a way, when we're moving outside into fiction, into another world, what we're really encountering is the self within which we are constantly shaping and reshaping and trying to make true.
I suppose that the natural question would be like the role of allegory in fiction, because, and in some sense, there's almost the allegory within the allegory. For example, you look at the Grand Inquisitor in the Brothers Karamazov. It's almost the idea that the Grand Inquisitor is the allegory within the allegory, in the same way that the Before the Law is allegory within the allegory of Kafka's The Trial, right? So I do think that there's an idea of there is fiction in a stricter sense, and then there is fiction of the fiction, which is found as fiction within the fiction. And in some sense, those are summaries or parts of the fiction which are more intense or perhaps more profound or insightful than what we see before.
Okay, so somehow it seems to us that allegory is sort of fiction abstracted out onto another level, right? And such a way, allegories are normally the most memorable parts of every single fictional book. And I think I agree with you that the central allegory is sort of this, not necessarily the key that opens up the entire book, but the node from which everything else makes sense. That's why I think, and that's why I think allegory is so endlessly interpretable. That's why like every single philosopher has their reading on Plato's allegory of the cave, precisely because that one allegory contains the entire life of the philosopher or the writer. And therefore, the one allegory, I think, going back to the previous theory of fiction, inducing the reader into a world. The allegory is like this key or this invitation for one to enter a world, and then everything else around the book is kind of this. It's making concrete of the allegory. So moving from the most abstract allegory down into the most concrete in order for the world to be really livable for you. And I think that might be also why we shouldn't just read the summary, but rather going to the book, because in order for you to actually interpret the world, interpret yourself and interpret the work, you have to enter the world and really live it. And in order for that world to be livable, you have to move from the abstract to the concrete in order for the world to build out. And if you only remain in the abstract, which is what happens if you only have the abstract, right, or have the summary of the whole thing, then fiction becomes useless in some sense.
I think that that's definitely interesting, and I think that if you take it to a more, I think one of the ways you can also look at it is in some ways that the allegory within the allegory is the representation of is almost the rawest, most abstract form of the fiction, if the fiction didn't get real enough. And perhaps a good example of this would be Before the Law by Kafka, where almost the entire situation of the story can be summarized into the trial. But at the same time, it seems very difficult to interpret the trial or Before the Law without the subject around it. And in some sense, you know how there's abstracts before philosophical essays. Perhaps allegory plays a similar way as that abstract.
Yeah.
Though it's impossible to understand, or at least fully understand, the abstract without the essay behind it.
Yeah, so that's why, like, why don't we just read the abstract in front of every single essay rather than reading the whole essay? It's somehow after you first get the abstract, and then you go through the whole thing, and when you come back to the abstract again, the abstract becomes a thinkable abstract. And I want to maybe claim the same thing for fiction, as in maybe you can have the skeletal plot, right, or the central allegory, but only when you go through the whole argument or the whole book, the whole world, can the skeleton of the plot make sense and be livable to you.
Well, I think that it is one of those things where you look at, I think perhaps the best way to look at it is the Christian story, right? It's kind of like you look through the lens of Christianity and you see all these different modes of being. And in some sense, the fundamental question in Christianity is, well, how on earth are we meant to live in the world without a savior? And that could perhaps be Christianity summarized. And in some ways, you could summarize Kafka's trial into that as well. The sense of you being before a crime which you kind of do not understand what you committed. Though I do think in some ways you intuitively know what you committed in some sense. And perhaps you could say that the totality of the sins that K committed is at the same time known and unknown to him. For example, we all know intuitively, at least that we all are fallen beings, whether you're Christian or not, right? There are problems within us, but at the same time, we do not recognize that fallen nature as crime. For example, it's kind of like how the person who hates himself for watching pornography all the time knows that he's a horrible person, or the person who does drugs knows that he's a horrible person. But yet, when he is asked, "Are you a horrible person? Do you deserve to go to jail, or do you deserve to receive punishment?" they say no. And in the same sense, it's kind of that relationship of denying the fact that you know what you've committed, but at the same time, you know that you've committed something wrong, which puts a predicament of humanity at kind of what the punishment gets. And this is kind of my interpretation of the trial now. And even though you could say it's overly Christianified, I do think it is perhaps one of the correct ways to look at it. In the same way, when in Before the Law, he goes and looks at goes to the gatekeeper. It's kind of the idea, that revelation of, well, yeah, I'm here my entire life, but in some sense, that is exactly where you are. And there's this beautiful Christian verse, which I was watching a sermon in the morning today, and this is what the pastor said. Of course, he didn't refer to the trial, but he said, "Whoever believes in him," referring to Christ, "is not condemned, but whoever who does not believe stands condemned already." It's the idea that you are judged before you even entered, not necessarily before you even entered it, but before your death, you are already judged. But it's rather at that point of the death, it's that point where the door opens, where you realize you're truly messed up and you're truly screwed now. If you don't have that resurrection, you don't have that salvation. I think that could be a way in which you look at all literature to some degree, to greater or lesser extent. It's like, well, we are all living in this world with that challenge, and you have to move beyond it, perhaps, to some degree.
Mm-hmm. Or can you even say, following our door metaphor, that the reading of fiction, this entering into another world, is exactly this opening of the door that is perpetually closed. Or whenever you're going really living out a single book, you're going through this Christian narrative. Because Jordan Peterson claims that sort of there's a story and then there's meta story, right? And for him, one of the best meta stories, the story of how stories transform themselves, is the Christian narrative. So in some sense, whenever you're reading a piece of fiction, what you're doing is living out Christ.
Indeed, I do think that there is that element there to some degree, and perhaps even in a more abstract sense, there is this idea that, well, they're fundamental archetypes, and that's why it goes to the question of kind of like, can we differentiate nonfiction from fiction? It's kind of the idea that, well, you're looking at these meta stories, and in some ways, it is these fundamental archetypes which repeat themselves over and over again throughout history. And a good example would be like the Oedipus complex, right? It occurs in Greece and it occurs in Russia as well. And I'm currently still doing my YouTube shorts. Or it doesn't sound more like the Warren Jew situation, because it's supposed that Warren Jew has to leave in like 20 minutes to have the Last Supper, though. Though I suppose the Last Supper could be a representation of a lot of different things, I suppose, especially if you are a Freudian in some degree. But I suppose the natural question is kind of like, there are these stories, there are these archetypes which repeat themselves constantly, and in some sense that is the meta story or the meta truth that you're trying to interact with in a Petersonian way, at least, I suppose.
Yeah, and there's a quite famous quote from David Foster Wallace, as you know, my favorite author, and someone like in an interview asked him, what do you think about realist fiction? Because people doesn't think that his novels are realistic. And he says is, well, every single writer wants to be a realist with a capital R. It's just that sort of this lowercase r realism of being truthful to every single detail in the world does not really get you to this capital R real, which every single writer, no matter in what style or what school they want to get to, is trying to represent.
I think that's definitely true. And I think if you look at Lord of the Rings or something like that, you could say, well, like someone would naturally say that is completely out there, but I don't think it is completely out there either. Like a lot of those values and stories can be applied to us today in the world. And it's kind of the idea of, well, I think that's also one of those ideas where kind of like the post-Enlightenment rational thoughts have kind of ruined the enterprise of literature, perhaps. And you could say, well, Leibniz was the last universal genius, and one of those reasons is because it kind of is a balance of that. And Voltaire's critique of Leibniz was also quite interesting in Candida, but then that also kind of shows that you don't need to be realist to understand how true things certainly are, at least in the lowercase r. If you look at Candida, it's like the most bloody, mentally out there book ever, but at the same time feels really real. Like, I mean, some of the stuff you see in Candida is like, was Voltaire on drugs when he wrote that? But at the same time, it is a very real book, and it's one of the books of the Western opens, perhaps to some degree, right? So I think it kind of ties in also to Benji's question of, do you think it's important for readers to learn to identify Jungian archetypes in fictional stories? Do you think that that's something which is a valuable thing to do, Drew?
I think by learning some Jungian theory, it helps you in reading fiction. But at the same time, there's so much nuance in every single book, and that is why you should read the book rather than having the archetype. I think one needs to be careful of fitting one's preconceived archetypes onto the story, but rather allow the archetype itself to develop and become more full in its interaction with the story.
I think perhaps a natural question as well lies here is that, and it's kind of this idea, I was talking with someone, it's kind of like your preconceived conception of someone else often defines how you interpret their actions, even if you don't really know what their actions actually are. And in some ways, I think that there is that important nature there as well. And in some ways, I think the more you read about Jungian archetypes, the more it defeats the purpose in the idea of archetypes themselves. In the sense that you should at least know the concepts of archetypes in the most simple way, but the moment you start delving too deep into them, it defeats that creative process of interacting with the work. Yeah. I think that is one of those things with Jungian archetypes, perhaps.
And it's more having the archetype in mind and then constantly breaking the archetype and rebuilding it. So, well, this links with something I want to move on to, right? So, recently I've been reading a lot of fiction. So after getting accepted to college, etc., and I sort of found two different things that fiction gives me. Right? One thing is that it it helps me think of the most abstract things. So in philosophy, there's sort of two different kinds, right? There's like this basis of intuition. It's like I know love is the greatest value, or I know freedom is the greatest value. And there's another kind of I need to prove through reason, through argument, why freedom is the greatest value. And what I think is that in reading fiction, it allows one to try to formulate sort of this most higher level abstract thing that is given in intuition, or it somehow hones my intuition in some way. I'm not sure how. Another one is that whenever I read some fiction, what the fiction I really love, the feeling I get is not necessarily that I got the answer from this book, but rather the book made everything much more mysterious and ambiguous than when I entered it. It somehow, I just don't understand how everything fits together, but it just feels so real. It's like sometimes those books have like these really small, strange but profound details. Like let's say for an example, this character just likes to touch his penis like every hour. He randomly touches his penis for no reason, and then like somehow some of the detail seems really profound, but you can't really understand why that detail seems profound to you. And in this sense, then I think with these overlaying of details, what fiction does is asks you questions rather than providing you answers. And maybe this is linked somehow in building your intuition for sort of the higher level stuff.
Mm-hmm. I do think that is true. I think that you've touched upon something which is very interesting, because if you're looking at your kind of these small details, I do think that at the same time there is a kind of point where you start to overthink certain things, and I think that sometimes things become way more. I suppose this ties into the next point as well about information density of fiction, is that kind of the moment you start trying to psychoanalyze or just analyze every single thing in fiction, what then occurs as well, I would say almost defeats the point of fiction as well. In some sense, when you approach a work of fiction, I think that you kind of are wrestling or torn between the idea of a Kierkegaardian kind of leap of faith into the fiction at the same time as interacting with it rationally. There's almost this kind of paradoxical dialectic line in which you have to walk by accepting the nature, the almost absurd nature of the fiction, while at the same time accepting the rational side of the fiction as well. I think that sometimes by analyzing too much, it almost defeats the entire point of fiction in the first place. I wonder what your thoughts are of this kind of between the two.
I would kind of disagree with you. I think the best way, what I found most rewarding when I'm approaching fiction is when sort of I have the text, but also I have some personal problem that I'm trying to solve. And what I'm doing, I'm sort of in dialogue with the book in order to understand my own personal problems. And on this way, I can try to live out the characters to really immerse myself in a story, or I can try to rationally analyze the different components of the story in a formalist way. But ultimately, I think what the books that had the novels that really had an impact on me was novels that were pertinent to my own situation in some way. And it is in this direct engagement, existential engagement with fiction, that I think it really shines compared to, or else I don't think there's much point in one reading a novel compared to just getting like a quick summary of it. If one cannot go into this mode of existential engagement. That's sort of what I think Barth talked about in The Pledge of the Text. Right? He is saying there's this pleasure of directly confronting the text and endlessly be in dialogue with it, actively interpreting, reinterpreting, and incorporating the text into one's own life, compared to passively absorbing the plot line and just going through the story as an observer.
I suppose that Barthian approach I would agree with to some degree, though I do think that I do think that actively interacting and absorbing the text is almost a passive interaction. And it seems contradictory, but I do think that when you get your best interaction with a work, it's not necessarily when you're forcefully trying to feed yourself a certain view of that work. You're not like oh, it's kind of like my Kafka's a trial and realization in the morning. It wasn't like, oh, I am analyzing strictly. I mean, we even made a live stream for an hour talking about Kafka's a trial, and that never came up to me at all.
And Josh is like randomly touching his penis. Like
my hands just like moving underneath the table and like, there's something a bit sus. But I do think that there's this idea of kind of it is precisely that idea of almost a passive acceptance and ponderance of life allows you to retrospectively understand certain texts. And in some sense, it's the active living in the world and that active kind of mode of being when you're interacting with everyday experiences, which oftentimes passively gives you a new insight into a work. And sometimes those insights are, I would say, almost more profound than kind of actively say, oh, I have a book in front of me, I must analyze it, if you got what I mean.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's more a kind of, it's so when you're reading fiction and immersing yourself into it, in the process of reading, you're in a sort of this highly concentrated state of trying, like, of everything being parameterized, and you have all the details getting in. And I guess what you want to do is to also have this highly diffuse state after reading a certain section, and just allowing thoughts about the characters, the plot, to come alive for you. And I think that works well in situations where you have something that you're doing that is not really demanding, and then you're allowing your brain to sort of wander in this diffuse way, and also preventing you to concentrate really, really heavily on actually thinking about the plot, because you actually have something to do. So for me, it's sort of playing an instrument. When I play an instrument and just reflect on the books I've read, I think I get a better understanding of the whole thing, and also it impacts my life more. And I'm wondering if you have like a similar practice.
I do think that's the case, and sometimes it's when I'm playing the cello or listening to music, perhaps, which allows me to give these insights. And I think that there's this kind of, I would say, reciprocal relationship when it comes to reading fiction. Like, does reading fiction improve decision-making skills? I do think that definitely helps, but in some sense it is, by living, you're able to read fiction better, and also by reading fiction, you live better as well. So I do think that there is two ways in which this goes, because I think that, and that's a question with the idiot, right? And it allows you to challenge yourself, saying, well, is Mushkin good or not? And I think that in literature, there's very rarely something which is more, how would I call it, more perplexing than the idiot. It just purely because it's almost impossible to understand whether what he's doing is good or not, because it does seem intuitively that he's good, but at the same time, he seems so socially inept that you wouldn't necessarily do that as well, if you know what I mean. So there is that kind of distinction there.
I feel like it would improve one's decision-making skills, but I wouldn't call it decision-making necessarily. I would say, I think it would allow one, first, it's the intuition that I was talking about before. So to be able to directly intuit values in the world. And I think that's one part of the decision-making component, how it improves it. But another is that I think it just, by thinking deeply about something, you get better at thinking deeply about something, right? That's the Aristotelian insight of how, like, doing something virtuously makes you more virtuous. And in the same way, by deeply thinking about the fictional situations, you allow their ability to reflect back onto your own life. And I think that also links to another thing about reading fiction. I feel like reading fiction is supposed to be difficult in some ways, and rather than being easy. So, and I think we normally have this, I guess, preconceived notion that reading fiction is easier than doing a lot of other things. Let's say being an English major is like at the lowest, or being a comp lit major is like at the lowest of the hierarchy of like all the majors. You have the STEM major on top, and then maybe the philosophy major, and then the other social sciences major. And then at the bottom, we just have like comp lit, where like no one cares about them.
Where do you think gender studies ranks on this list of hierarchy of majors?
I think gender studies is around the same as comp lit in terms of the discrimination hierarchy, right? And I think it's supposed to be difficult in some ways if you do it right, when you're doing comp lit. That you have a certain quality of thinking that is as profound as sort of things at the higher level of this hierarchy. But the problem is that one can slide into this complacency when one's reading fiction. So, like, I guess my most profound experiences when reading fiction is the experience of, well, I'm reading the thing, but it's there's so much meaning inside it that I almost cannot take the whole thing anymore, and I have to stop and reflect on it because I feel like I'm losing track of everything. It's overwhelming me.
Mm-hmm. I definitely think that is the case. In Benji refers to Hegel, who's someone who I don't really know much about, but says, or someone who said that you can only understand after reading it twice. Do you think that's true? Because I do think intuitively I do learn books more after I've read them twice.
That's in the preface of the phenomenology of spirit, I think, and well, Hegel was directly. I think Hegel was first referring to his own prose, which, if you ever read him, I don't think one can understand it, even if one has read it twice, maybe like 3 or 4 times, or 5. But I think what Hegel is referring to is this: that the specific quality of fiction is that the meaning of the events as it is happening is ambiguous until everything unfolds. So in some sense, the meaning of Jesus' death is ambiguous until the resurrection, right? So in this sense, then, fiction is completely is almost this organic whole in which none of the parts can be interpreted without consideration of everything else. And in this sense, I think there's a value first in immersing oneself in the story rather than reading it twice. And I think the value perhaps is in this constant breaking of one's expectation and reinterpreting of the situation, because that's sort of honing down the decision-making skills that we're doing just then, but also enabling us to break down archetype and rebuilding it, as we were talking about before.
Though I would disagree with you on the Jesus Christ death kind of thing, because I do think that the death and the resurrection should be separated, in the sense that it is written in the Bible that the wages of sin is death, and the death was given on the cross. So in some senses, the wages of the sin, like Jesus' mission was completed, theoretically, to save man from his sin just by his death alone. But rather, what the resurrection tells us is that, well, via the resurrection of Christ is with us. It's not just that the sins are done, but rather that the sins, we have a guidance forward. Because I had this dream, and I told you about this dream, it was like ages ago, right? But I had this dream the other night, and not the other night, but like a few months ago. But then essentially what happened in this dream was, well, I helped someone solve their problem, right? But then the person was like, well, I messed up so badly that I'm definitely going to fall back into the same problem again. And I was like, all right, it doesn't matter. I'm going to always be here for you. And then it's that kind of like, I solved the problem and then I'm always going to be here for you, is the separation between the death and then the resurrection. And I think that is the separation, in the sense that they're both infinitely definable by their own action and have infinite significance within themselves, perhaps.
Well, I guess I was referring to sort of the Pauline idea that without the resurrection, everything is lost, right? So somehow it is the resurrection that retroactively justifies the death as the meaning that we are giving it right now. And I'm not saying that the Bible is fiction, but I think one can read it in a profoundly fictional way. And it is one of the best pieces of fiction, even if one just puts it in its fictional context, right? And I guess the idea then is that one can only read a sentence by reading it twice. I think Hegel specifically said a philosophical sentence. And for him, a philosophical sentence is a sentence that develops the idea in some way. And for him, idea like a capital I. And for him, this developing of the idea in a philosophical sentence is when the sentence itself breaks down some preconceived notion, breaks down some previous concept that we have, whilst building something new, waiting for itself to be broken down again. So in this sense, then, when you're reading a really good philosophy text, you're almost going through the same process that you're reading fiction, because a really good one doesn't really just tell you the conclusion, right? It leads you through the entire thought process of how the conclusion was how the author arrived at the conclusion. And by making you go through the whole process, you're like, well, I just spent 20 hours in order for Hegel to say that nothing happened, right? That everything just went back into what it was. What one has acquired, I think it's the same thing as what one has acquired in reading fiction, is this entire world that the philosophical that the author of the philosophy book is living through, and the entire thought process.
Mm-hmm. And perhaps this is a very good place to end off this discussion, because Warren Jew, of course, has to go to his Oedipal family reunion dinner in a few moments. But I hope you've all had a good video. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to like and subscribe. It means a lot to me, and it really helps this channel grow. Next week, I have my good friend Zach on from Adherent Apologetics, who has like 4 times more subscribers than I do. But make sure you go check out that live stream. I'm not sure when actually it is, but it is on the 30th. So have a great day, my friends. See you soon. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next one. Stay safe, my friends.